If somebody told you to jump off a bridge, would you? The right answer is, of course, you would not. You're not an idiot. You make your own decisions. You're your own person. Just because somebody tells you to do something doesn't mean you should go and do it. And if what they're asking you to do is wrong or bad, you certainly can't blame them. You decide your own actions. But that's slightly different when you're in the army. You have to follow orders in the army. That's the whole point of the army, following orders. But what if those orders are wrong or mistaken? What if it's really obvious that the orders are wrong or mistaken? What if everybody knows that the orders are wrong except for the person delivering the orders? Our problem here is this man has all the power and this man has no power. What is this soldier supposed to do? What would you do if you were the soldier? And once the battle is over and it's discovered that the orders were wrong or mistaken, what should happen to the guy giving the orders? Should he be punished? Should he be forgiven? It's this difficult problem, what we call a dilemma. That's the subject of our next poem. The poem is Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. As with all the poems, you need to know the context, the story, language, structure, and the reason the poet wrote it. In this case, the context, the story, and the reason the poet wrote the poem are very much interlinked. And so in this presentation, you'll probably find that I'll be talking about all three, but you'll see what I mean as we go along. As with all the poems, let's begin with context. We're talking 1854. Britain was in a war with Russia. We were fighting at a place called Balaclava. It was a battle we lost. We lost because a mistake was made, which led to a regiment of the army called the Light Brigade to be given a set of orders demanding that they charge at the Russian forces, even though the Russian forces all had a lot of cannons pointing right at them. The reason why the mistake happened isn't important. Mistakes happen all the time. We all make mistakes every single day. What's particularly important with this mistake, though, is it led to a set of military orders. And as we talked about at the beginning, in the army, you're supposed to follow orders. The only people who don't follow orders are traitors. No soldier wants to be a traitor. Therefore, you follow orders. And so, knowing full well that the chances of survival were very, very slim, the brave soldiers charged into battle as ordered, only to be torn to pieces by cannons not only in front of them, but to either side as well. It was, in short, a massacre. For ordinary Victorians back in Britain, this came as a great shock. It was not only a humiliating defeat for, at the time, the most powerful country in the world, it was a defeat all because of a mistake. They'd also lost the best of the British Army. I know they're the very best, because if a soldier is meant to follow orders, then the very best soldier will follow orders even though they know he will die. Following an order, knowing that it's probably going to lead to your death, has to be the very definition of bravery. Doing something you don't want to do because it's the right thing to do. Whether you think what the soldiers did was right or wrong isn't important. What is important is, by our very simple understanding of what it is to be a soldier, they met that standard perfectly, and therefore they became heroes. And everybody wanted to talk about it and wanted to write about it. It was the hot topic of the day. So of course there were lots of poems written about it as well. The poem that is considered one of the best about this event, and one of the best poems ever written, was The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Let's take a look at the story behind the poem. It's pretty simple. It's just an explanation of what happened on the day. In the first stanza we find out that there were 600 soldiers. We were told that the rough distance they had to travel was half a league between the safety of their camp and the enemy, which is about 3 kilometres. We also see what their orders were. They were told to go forward, charge for the guns. That means charge at the guns that the Russians had. What was their reaction? Well, was there a man dismayed? Was there somebody who was a bit annoyed about that? No. They didn't make any questions of the orders, they didn't make a reply, they didn't ask why, they just went ahead and died because they were ordered to. And as they were charging forward, we learned that they were facing a lot of cannons to the right, left and in front of them. But still, they rode forward. They got closer, they flashed their sabres. Sabres are a sort of long sword, a bit like that. Of course, they were facing gunners. They plunged into the smoke of the cannons, attacked the Cossacks and the Russians, who reeled from the sabre stroke. That means that the Russians were pushed back and then they returned. But unfortunately not the 600. A lot of them had died. Again, just a repetition of how many cannons there were to emphasise the danger that they were in. The poet just summarises the experience that they had whilst they were fighting the Germans, how they were heroes, how they'd fought so well in the jaws of death, in the mouth of hell. In some way, it's just the memory of that greatness that is all that was left of them. And finally, the poet's personal thoughts on it. He believes that they're covered in glory. He uses a rhetorical question: when can the glory fade? In other words, never. He also suggests that the whole world was focused on this particular event. And as we learn in the context, that's true. The whole world was looking at this event. The whole world was shocked by this event. The whole world was talking about this event. And finally, the poet reminds us that we should honour these particular soldiers in the same way that we honour soldiers on Poppy Day, but these guys in particular. These guys are particularly honourable for what they did. You can see how the context and the story are beginning to blur together, as I said they would. And this also leads to quite a clear idea about the writer's intention here. The writer, the poet, wanted people to remember the sacrifice that these soldiers had made at Balaclava, but also wanted to make sure that we would honour them as well. There is throughout the poem a sense of tragedy that such a great loss of life happened. Again, the poet wants to get across his sense of sadness that this should happen. It's not necessarily an anti-war poem, it's more of a reminder to the reader to remember, to honour, and to be aware of the tragedy that happened. Okay, let's take a closer look at the language that the poet has used and the effect this has on the reader, and how the poet uses language to tell us something about power. Remember, all the poems are about power. Whenever you're writing about them, you're exploring how the poet in some way reveals or says something about power. Remember as well, in this particular story, you have the people giving the orders have an enormous amount of power, and the soldiers themselves, they don't have very much power. It's their job just to follow the orders. So let's start with some really obvious ones. They had to charge into the Valley of Death. Metaphor suggesting that the valley that they were riding into contained a lot of danger and an almost certain chance of dying. And notice how the poet has capitalised the word death. We capitalise things when they are names or the start of sentences. But in this case, the poet is personifying death, turning death into an actual person with a real name. And this, I believe, is an attempt to create a sense of realism for the reader to believe how dangerous death was, that death as an individual, as a real person, if you like, also has a certain amount of power over the soldiers. We have a certain amount of repetition here. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. This repetition emphasises, that means makes stand out, why these soldiers did something so dangerous to their own lives. It emphasises that they understood what it was to be a soldier, not to make a reply to an order, just to follow them. Not to question the orders, but just to follow them. And if you're asked to do something and it involves your death, you go ahead and do it. This repetition of these reasons why the soldiers did what they did make them the heroes that they are, the reader understands that although the soldiers have no power at all, they're the ones that come out the most respected, the most celebrated. They come out as people of enormous power. We have more repetition here. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. Why have we got repetition? What's the poet trying to suggest here? The use of the repetition emphasises just how many cannons they were facing. There were a lot of cannons, hence it was a massacre. And this use of repetition, just to the word cannon, gets across the idea of how powerful weapons in war can be and how powerless the soldiers were against so many cannons. We've got a nice example of alliteration here, stormed at with shot and shell. You get the sh sound of perhaps bullets flying through the air. The sh sound is not meant to be particularly nice. Again, this emphasises just how dangerous the experience was for them. Remember, that's an example there of alliteration. And also in there, another couple of beautiful metaphors to describe the powerlessness of the soldiers and the power of the situation that they were charging towards. Metaphors: jaws of death, mouth of hell. What do we think of when we think of the word hell? We think of somewhere terrible, we think of suffering. So we see that the soldiers themselves are charging towards something where they are going to suffer horribly. They have no power to contradict the orders. All they can do is suffer. But they were very brave. They flashed their sabres. This shows that the soldiers, although they were powerless, they were brave. They charged in, plunged. A nice verb there, just again emphasising how despite their powerlessness, they followed those orders. And again, were very brave. Again, the poet's just chosen to repeat the same line again, so sort of repetition of repetition further emphasises the danger that the men were putting themselves into. And finally, at the end, we get a clear view of the soldiers from the poet's perspective. They live in glory. They are glorious people, even though they were powerless, because of the wild charge that they made, something almost unthinking. They didn't spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not they should follow the orders. They didn't question the orders, they just did what they had to do. That's what made them brave soldiers. A reminder as well that the world looked on and wondered. We have the repetition of the word honour there as well. Again, to emphasise how great the soldiers were, and finally how noble they are. Noble is usually a word reserved for royalty because of their enormous power, but in this case the poet feels perfectly justified in applying this same term to poor soldiers because of what they did. Who benefited from the soldiers' actions? It really was the country. Their sacrifice was because their country asked them to make it, and their country in a sense was the one that made the mistake. So we as a country owe a great debt to those soldiers for the sacrifice that they made. Even though we ultimately lost the war, it is because of soldiers like this, the ones that don't question orders, the ones that just go ahead and fight in a war. It's those sorts of soldiers that we need to be thankful for as a country. They're the ones defending us. They're the ones fighting. And in a sense, it's the responsibility of the country. It's the responsibility of the people in charge of the country. It's the responsibility of the people in power to make sure that mistakes like this do not happen again. So what can we say about the structure? Well, first of all, it's in the third person. It has to be, I suppose, in the third person because the poet himself wasn't there. He's telling a story. He's telling events that happened to somebody else. In a way, the poem would be impossible in the first person, because if it was in the first person, you probably have to have it from the perspective of a soldier. And a soldier is not going to start talking about how honourable he is, or how glorious he is, or how noble he is, because that would kind of destroy the idea that the soldiers made a sacrifice for their country. Not very nice when people do something fantastic and then start telling everybody about how fantastic they are. That would kind of destroy the sense of nobility and honour that we need to give the soldiers. So it had to be in the third person so that we could understand the events as if we were watching them ourselves from the sidelines, perhaps. And that way we're allowed to make up our own minds. Secondly, have you ever had an experience where you can see something bad is going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it, and in a sense you just watch the events happen one after the other, knowing full well what's going to happen? Like watching somebody carrying a big load of books. You know they're going to drop all the books and they're going to fall over, and you're just kind of watching it happen. There's a kind of inevitability to what's about to happen. This sense of inevitability of time moving towards the ultimate sacrifice that these guys had to give comes from the rhythm that the poet incorporates into his poem. You can almost hear the horses charging forward, galloping almost, half-a-league, half-a-league, half-a-league onward. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. This use of repetition and the syllables within each line give it this idea of horses moving forward. This hints towards the power of the army itself being organised, and because there aren't any breaks in that rhythm, it's constantly moving forward. It emphasises how the soldiers did not stop. Again, reminding us that it's theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Just go forward and do it. And finally, how does the poem end? Well, it ends with the poet telling us almost directly what he wants his reader to think. How power from the people in charge in the army and from the people in charge of the country had been possibly abused, or the power had simply made a mistake, and the consequences of that mistake is extraordinary tragedy, not only for the soldiers themselves and their families, but for the country as a whole. He wants us to understand that great power can make mistakes, and when they do, the people who suffer are the powerless. And in this particular case, the poet would like us to honour the powerless, honour those who gave their lives for their country. This isn't a particularly difficult idea to understand. We do exactly the same thing every year when we celebrate Poppy Day. Poppy Day is a time when we remember those powerless individuals decades ago who gave their lives so that we could live in freedom. So we've looked at the context story of the poem. We've mentioned a little bit about intention. We've looked at the language and structure. So let's just return to intention and make sure that we're clear on it. Again, what does the poet want to say about power here? He wants to tell us that there is a responsibility for those people who are in power, and there is also great honour available to people who are powerless. Even if you don't have power, even if you're poor or not in a decision-making position, you can still be an honourable person, you can still be a noble person, you can still be a great person. And the poet wants the audience to be thankful for the sacrifices these sorts of individuals make. So what could these poems compare to? Well, any of the poems about war are a good option here. So what do we have? We've got Exposure. This one, although it's a poem about war, it's actually about the power of nature, and shows us that although war is a powerful place to be in, very dangerous, it's nature that is ultimately more powerful than all the guns and all the bullets you can put together. Similarly, you've got Bayonet Charge. Also Remains, War Photographer, about how audiences have become used to seeing horrific pictures of war. And Kamikaze, as particularly kamikaze, as in this situation, the soldier decided to disobey the orders he was given, and as a consequence lives a pretty miserable life. So there we go, guys. We've covered the context, the story, the language, the structure, and the reason why the poet wrote it. It's a fairly short poem. I think it's fairly easy to understand. It's a good one, particularly if you want to compare a war poem. It's an easy one to remember. And if any of you are interested, if you go onto Wikipedia and look up this poem, you can find a recording made by Alfred Lord Tennyson himself before the 1900s. Look, he died in 1892, so before then, and he recorded his voice on what's called a wax cylinder. So you can actually hear Alfred Lord Tennyson read this poem himself if you're interested. Thanks for watching. Keep up the revision.